Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is December 5th, 2025. And that date is really, really important for what we're talking about today.
It is.
We're diving into European cybersecurity, specifically the huge shift that is the NIS2 Directive.
Right. Network and information security, too.
And we're not just talking about deadlines that are coming up. We're talking about obligations that, legally should already be in force.
That's the tricky part, isn't it? We're in this really unprecedented regulatory environment where the EU mandate is out there, but the national laws, the ones that give it the final teeth, they're all staggered.
So the EU-wide deadline for transposition was back in October 2024.
Correct. October 17th.
But as we're sitting here today, December 5th, 2025, we know that a lot of major economies like the Netherlands and Germany are still working on their national laws.
Exactly. The Netherlands is looking at, Q2 2026 for its effective date. And Germany, well, they were aiming for early 2025, but the legislative process is still ongoing.
It feels a bit like legal quicksand then. The directive is technically active, the spirit of the law is there, and regulators are, starting to set precedents for what good enough looks like in this weird gray area. So our mission today is to dive deep into all the sources we have on NIS2 and give you a really clear, actionable roadmap. We want you to walk away understanding exactly who has to comply, what these new rules are demanding, and crucially, where the liability lands, especially for the C-suite. Okay, let's unpack this.
What's fascinating here, I think, is just the sheer ambition of the directive.
Right.
It's all driven by this one core objective, to establish a high common level of cybersecurity across the entire EU. It's trying to fix the fragmentation that, frankly, NIS1 completely failed to solve.
So what was the big problem with NIS1?
Well, you look at major attacks, things like NotPetya or other big supply chain breaches, and it became really obvious that a vulnerability in one country or even in one supposedly non-essential supplier could paralyze an entire ecosystem. NIS2 just casts a much, much wider net to fix that.
And the most critical takeaway, it seems, isn't even a technical one. It's about governance.
Absolutely. NIS2 fundamentally redefines the role and the responsibility of management bodies. We're talking about the C-suite, the board of directors. This is no longer just an IT budget problem.
It's a fiduciary duty, a personal liability issue.
Precisely. It transitions cybersecurity compliance from, a checkbox activity that CISO handles to a mandatory matter of personal accountability for the senior-most management. And that just elevates the urgency completely. You have to be able to prove to regulators that the board has skin in the game.
And navigating this kind of complexity, the requirements, the deadlines, getting the right tools in place, it's a lot. And before we go deeper, we need to take a quick moment to thank the sponsors who make these detailed deep dives possible.
This deep dive is brought to you by www.cisomarketplace.com and www.compliancehub.wiki. And if you're grappling with a regulation as complex as NIS2, which, it mandates 10 specific technical controls, a non-negotiable incident reporting clock, and requires you to map all your evidence to standards like ISO 27001, right? These platforms offer the tools and the knowledge you need. They really help turn the chaos of compliance documentation into confidence. They give you those organized resources you need to document every single step for the authorities.
Okay, so let's start with that seismic shift. From NIS1 to NIS2, which is officially Directive EU 22D2-555. You said NIS1 failed. Why? What was the core flaw?
The primary challenge with NIS1 was just how subjective it was. It used these vague labels like operators of essential services or OES.
And each country decided who fit that label.
Exactly. The member states had way too much discretion, which led to this wildly inconsistent application across the EU. An energy company in one country might be an OES, but a similar one next door might not be.
And attackers could just exploit that, find the weakest link in the supply chain that happens to be in a less regulated jurisdiction?
You've got it. That's the fragmentation NIS2 addresses head-on. It moves to much clearer, much more objective criteria. It's a dual test, your size and your sector. That's it.
And as we're sitting here in December 2025, we have to stress this again. Even if the final national law isn't on the books in your country, regulators expect to see you making a demonstrable effort. Inaction is not an option.
That expectation is absolutely vital. The absence of a final national law is not a free pass. It's not a postponement. You have to operate as if the rules apply to you right now. So let's get into those criteria.
Okay, so criteria number 1 is your sector of activity. Are you operating in a sector that's listed in Annex 4, the highly critical sectors, or Annex 2, the other critical sectors?
And criterion 2 is the size cap rule. Basically, are you a medium or a large enterprise according to the EU's established thresholds?
Let's nail down those size thresholds because they're the first filter. They determine your classification and, your ultimate liability. So walk us through the SME definition.
Right, so the EU's categorization is very precise. It's based on your staff count and your financials. First, you have micro or small enterprises. These are generally out of scope. That's fewer than 50 employees and an annual turnover or balance sheet of 10 million euros or less.
The key word there is and, right? You have to be under both.
Correct. But then when you get to a medium-sized enterprise, it changes. That's between 50 and 249 employees, or an annual turnover up to 50 million euros, or a balance sheet total up to 43 million euros.
So that or is the big differentiator for medium-sized businesses.
It is. The entity can use the lower of the two financial figures if they want to try and stay classified as an SME, which in most cases keeps them out of scope. Unless, of course, they fall into one of the special exceptions, like, say, a top-level domain registry, which is in scope regardless of its size.
And then when we get to the large enterprise, the definition tightens up again.
It does. A large enterprise is 250 or more employees, or they have to exceed both financial ceilings. That's an annual turnover greater than 50 million euros and a balance sheet total greater than 43 million.
So if you have, say, 200 employees but a huge turnover, you're still considered medium.
In that case, yes. If you're under 250 staff, you must meet both financial thresholds to be considered large. Otherwise, you're medium. But being medium still brings you into scope as an important entity. So calculating your size accurately is step 0.
Okay, let's talk sectors. This is where the expansion is just massive. NIS2 covers 18 sectors in total. What are the big takeaways from Annex I, the highly critical sectors?
Annex I is really the backbone of society. It's the stuff that, if it goes down, everything grinds to a halt. So you've got the traditional infrastructure, energy, transport, all forms, air, rail, water, road, healthcare, drinking water.
But the big change is the inclusion of the digital backbone, right?
That's the crucial expansion. We're now talking about digital infrastructure. That means cloud computing providers, data centers, TLD registries, DNS service providers, and, very importantly, ICT service management.
Let's pause on that one. ICT service management. That means managed service providers, MSPs, and managed security service providers, MSSPs. Bringing them in fundamentally changes the game.
It does, because they are systemic risk providers.
A single point of failure.
Absolutely.
Right.
An attack on one MSP could compromise hundreds, maybe thousands of their clients all at once. It's a classic supply chain risk. So by making them essential entities, NIS2 is trying to secure that foundational tech layer for everyone else. We also see public administration in there, which is a big deal. Central government services are under the same rules.
And we should touch on the big exception here. Banking and financial services are listed, but they really answer to a different law, DORA.
That's right. DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, is what we call lex specialis, the more specific law. So if you're a financial entity, DORA is your Bible, but its requirements are at least equivalent to NIS2 and often even more strict. The goal is a cohesive regulatory fabric.
Okay, let's shift to Annex 2, other critical sectors. This is where a lot of companies who've never dealt with mandatory cyber regulation are going to find themselves. What are some of the surprising additions here?
Annex 2 is really where the shock waves are hitting the industrial base. The biggest ones are food production, processing, and distribution.
At an industrial scale, not the local farm.
Right. Wholesale and industrial. We're also seeing the manufacture of chemicals and a huge part of the manufacturing sector itself. Specifically, companies that make things like medical devices, computer and electronic products, electrical equipment.
So if you're a factory making, I don't know, advanced robotics for car plants, you're now potentially an important entity facing audits and fines.
Exactly. And it's not just about your finished product. It's about the integrity of that entire manufacturing supply chain. Postal and courier services are in Annex 2 now, waste management too. It's a recognition that national resilience depends on a secure industrial and logistics base.
And this whole classification process, whether you're an essential or an important entity, that's the line in the sand. It determines everything about how you're supervised. Why is this two-tier system so important?
It dictates the entire posture of the regulator towards you, and it dictates your level of internal readiness.
So essential entities or EEs?
Those are generally the large companies in the Annex I sectors. Because their disruption would cause severe societal damage, they face proactive supervision. The regulators use the term ex-ante checks.
And the important entities or AEs?
That's your medium-sized companies in Annex 1 And all the medium and large companies in Annex 2, they face reactive supervision or ex post.
What does that actually look like in practice? What's the difference between proactive and reactive?
Well, if you're an EE, an essential entity, the national competent authorities are actively and constantly auditing your security. They can conduct regular security audits, on-site inspections, off-site supervision, and they have the power to issue legally binding instructions with hard deadlines. You have to be audit ready 24/7.
So the burden of proof is always on the EE to show they're compliant, even if nothing has gone wrong.
Precisely. Whereas if you're an IE, an important entity, supervision is generally triggered by a failure.
So a breach or evidence of noncompliance.
Right. They can still hit you with targeted security audits and scans, but the initial monitoring is reactive. This distinction is the absolute core of NIS2 accountability. It should be driving your entire resource allocation strategy right now. If you're an EE, the time for preparation is over. You should be optimizing and gathering evidence.
And for any organization out there just trying to figure out where they stand, especially those who just got pulled into scope by that Annex 2 expansion, mastering all this is a huge task.
It truly is. Which is why this segment of the deep dive is proudly supported by www.cisomarketplace.com and www.compliancehub.wiki. If you need to map your operations to those Annex I and II sectors, or even just establish an accurate self-classification, these platforms have the organized resources. Whether you're trying to align your existing NIST framework with NIS2 or starting from scratch, they help you build that baseline confidence and provide the documentation templates you'll need.
Okay, so we've covered the who. Let's move to the what. Article 21 is really the heart of NIS2. It lays out the 10 mandatory minimum cybersecurity risk management measures that every single in-scope entity has to implement.
And it's more than just a checklist. We have to remember the foundational principles here. The measures must be appropriate, they must be proportionate, they have to be based on the state of the art, and this is crucial. They have to adopt an all-hazards approach.
All hazards. That sounds like it goes beyond just cyber attacks. It's about integrating physical security too, right?
Exactly. It mandates that your protection has to cover threats to your digital systems and their physical environments. So think data centers, control rooms, critical infrastructure sites. You have to document your physical access controls, your environmental monitoring, your disaster prep for things like floods or fires. It all has to be part of your documented cyber risk posture now.
All right, let's break down these 10 measures. We can group them to make it clearer. Let's start with the foundation, governance and response. That's measures 1, 2, and 3.
All right, so measure #1, policies on risk analysis and information system security. This means you have to do mandatory, regular risk assessments. The big challenge here for a lot of the newly scoped companies, especially in manufacturing, is integrating IT and OT risk management.
Yeah, that IT-OT convergence is a massive headache. How does a risk policy handle, say, old operational technology systems that can't be patched?
That's the million-dollar question. Your OT environment is often full of these legacy proprietary systems. Your risk assessment has to specifically catalog them, identify their potential blast radius if they get compromised, and then document your compensating controls.
So you can't secure the device itself, you have to secure the network around it.
Precisely. Things like physical segregation of the network, one-way data diodes, applying security controls at the perimeter, like zero-trust network access. Because direct implementation on the device is often impossible.
Okay, next up is measure #2, incident handling. This means having defined processes for detection, response, and recovery.
This goes way beyond a simple checklist in a binder. To operationalize this, you need to invest in advanced detection tools. You need real-time monitoring through things like a SEM security information and event management system or a SO platform for automated response. If you can't demonstrate that you have swift automated detection, you will fail to meet that 24/72/30 reporting clock we'll talk about later.
And then measure #3, business continuity. How robust does that disaster recovery plan need to be?
It needs to be tested, documented, and resilient against a complete system-wide failure. So that means having crisis management protocols, full disaster recovery plans, and this is critical, robust, up-to-date backup management.
Not just any backups.
No, we're talking immutable backups, segmented backups, off-site data storage, things that prevent ransomware from wiping out both your primary systems and your recovery options at the same time. A regulator is going to ask, when was the last time you actually tested your failover procedures? And you better have a good answer.
Okay, so that's the internal foundation. The next group is probably the hardest to manage because it's external. The supply chain and system lifecycle. That's measures 4 and 5.
Right. And measure #4, supply chain security. This is arguably the most far-reaching measure in the whole directive because it essentially exports compliance requirements through your contracts.
How so?
Entities have to assess the vulnerabilities specific to each direct supplier and look at the overall security quality of their third parties.
So if I'm an essential entity and I use a smaller, important entity as a supplier and they have a breach, I'm still on the hook.
You are. So you have to weaponize your contracts.
Yeah.
You have to impose strict security obligations on your suppliers. You require them to have mandatory MFA. You ask for proof of ISO 27001 certification. You demand clear reporting requirements if they have an incident. You need the right to audit them. Essentially, you have to force your suppliers to meet your NIS2 security standards, even if they aren't directly in scope themselves.
If you don't track that contractually, you're just passively accepting all that risk.
Exactly. And this isn't a one-time vetting process, it's continuous monitoring. And this ties into measure #5, acquisition, development, and maintenance of network and information systems. This is all about security by design.
So a secure development lifecycle, or SDLC.
Right. Building security in from the very beginning of a project or procurement process, not just trying to bolt it on at the end. It also requires you to have effective vulnerability handling and disclosure procedures.
Okay, let's move to the hardcore technical controls and verification. That's measures 8, 10, and 6. Let's start with the one that's a bright red line, measure #10, multi-factor authentication, MFA.
This is completely non-negotiable. MFA or some form of continuous authentication solution must be implemented. For most organizations, this is the quickest, most effective single measure you can take. But again, as we discussed with OT systems, legacy infrastructure is a real challenge.
Right. I can't put an MFA prompt on my 15-year-old factory control panel, so how do I comply?
This is where that strategic implementation of Zero Trust Network Access, or ZTNA, comes into play. Instead of trying to update the legacy device itself, you enforce MFA at the perimeter when a user tries to access the network segment that hosts that old device.
Ah, okay.
ZTNA lets you create these granular, context-aware access policies. It enables the principle of least privilege, which also ties directly into measure #9.
And what about measure #8, policies regarding the use of cryptography and encryption?
It's a simple concept, but the execution can be complex. It means using robust, state-of-the-art encryption. So end-to-end encryption for data in transit, that's your VPNs, your TLS 1.3, your ZTNA tunnels, and at-rest encryption for sensitive files, databases, and backup tapes. You have to document your key management practices too.
Okay, now for what might be the most strategically important measure of all. Measure #6, policies and procedures to assess the effectiveness of cybersecurity risk management measures. This seems to be what separates NIS2 from being just a paperwork exercise.
This is the operational proof. This is the show me, don't tell me clause.
Right.
Regulators are no longer satisfied with just seeing a policy document sitting on a server. They demand measurable metrics and regular evaluation of how your controls are actually performing. You need demonstrable, audit-ready evidence.
What kind of metrics are they looking for? What proves effectiveness?
They're looking for things like your mean time to detect, or MTTD, and your mean time to respond, MTTR. They want to see your vulnerability patching cadence. How fast are you fixing critical flaws? They'll look at the success rate of your internal phishing simulations. And they'll definitely want to see the outcomes of your annual external penetration tests and red team exercises. If you can't quantify the performance of your controls, you can't prove effectiveness, period.
That requires some serious GRC tooling.
It does. Finally, we have the people and process measures, 7 and 9.
Okay.
Measure #7. Basic cyber hygiene practices and cybersecurity training. This applies to everyone from the front desk to the boardroom. And it includes mandatory, specific training for the management bodies themselves. And this can't just be an annual click-through slide deck. It has to be ongoing and based on realistic scenarios.
And measure #9, human resources, access control policies, and asset management.
This is all about managing the human factor, which is usually the biggest vulnerability. It requires clear onboarding and offboarding procedures for access rights, rigorous asset inventory management, which is a huge challenge in OT environments, and strict adherence to the principle of least privilege access. ZTNA solutions are a very efficient way to enforce that dynamically.
The technical depth required for all 10 of these measures, but especially measure #6, proving effectiveness. It's a huge step up for a lot of these newly included companies.
And that's where the administrative burden can just become overwhelming. I mean, if you're struggling to enforce mandatory MFA across all your different systems, or you need to build that audit-proof evidence chain for control effectiveness that maps to global standards, external tools are pretty much essential.
Mastering that technical implementation and all the documentation that goes with it is crucial. And that's why we rely on the expert platforms linked to www.cisomarketplace.com. They can connect you with the tools you need for technical implementation, risk assessment, and evidence collection. Or you can visit www.compliancehub.wiki for detailed guides on how to integrate these NIS2 requirements with your existing frameworks, like ISO 27001, which can really streamline the whole effort. Okay, let's talk about what happens when everything goes wrong. Let's talk about panic mode. Article 23 imposes these really strict accelerated incident reporting obligations. We're calling it the 24/72/30 timeline.
In a crisis, the regulator views your speed and your transparency as a direct measure of your operational discipline. It's a public test.
First, we need to define the trigger. What counts as a significant incident?
The definition is an incident that causes or is capable of causing severe operational disruption or financial loss for your entity, or one that causes considerable material or non-material damage to other people or entities.
And for digital service providers, there's even more specific guidance.
Yes, they also have to reference a commission implementing regulation that was published back on October 17th, 2024, which gives very specific cases for their sector.
The timeline starts the moment you become aware. You stressed earlier that the biggest mistake is waiting for certainty. Why is it better to be fast and imperfect than slow and certain?
Because the entire goal of that first 24-hour window is threat intelligence sharing. The regulators want to know now if this is a widespread attack vector so they can warn other critical entities across the EU.
So if you delay, you're seen as hindering the collective defense.
Exactly. And that will result in much heavier penalties. They will penalize a delay much more harshly than they would penalize you for reporting a suspected incident that later turns out to be minor.
Okay, walk us through the deadlines. What happens first?
The 24-hour early warning. This has to be submitted without undue delay. It's just an initial assessment. You need to declare the basic nature of the incident, whether it's still ongoing, if it has potential cross-border impact, and your first guess at how critical it is. Your internal response plan absolutely must name the specific person or team responsible for hitting send on this. It can't be an afterthought.
Then we get to the 72-hour expanded report, or the incident notification. What's expected here?
Within 72 hours of awareness, you have to provide the results of your primary investigation, the evolving impact, what you've done to mitigate it, and the likely root cause, if you have any idea at that point.
And this is where the cross notifications come in.
Crucially, yes. This is where regulators check your due diligence. You must confirm any other notifications you've made. Specifically, have you notified the Data Protection Authority, the DPA, under GDPR if personal data was involved?
That synchronization is so important. You have to run GDPR and NIS2 in lockstep.
Absolutely. The GDPR 72-hour clock for a data breach starts at the same time. If PII, personally identifiable information, is involved, you need coordinated, parallel notification pathways. The auditors will check if your NIS2 report references your GDPR notification and vice versa. Messing that up just compounds your legal exposure.
And finally, the 1 month or 30-day executive closure.
This is the definitive record. It needs a detailed incident description, a definitive root cause analysis, documentation of all your lessons learned, proof of full remediation, and, this is key, it requires executive or board-level sign-off.
So the board has to personally sign off on the final report.
They do. And if the incident is really complex and still ongoing at 30 days, you submit a detailed status report then, and then the final closure report a month after you finally contained it. This report is what the regulator will use to judge whether your initial control effectiveness measure #6 was actually adequate.
We have to talk about the external complexity here. What about the territorial scope for, say, a multinational company or a non-EU entity? It sounds like the marketplace principle, like we see with GDPR, is at play here.
It is. NIS2 applies extraterritorially. If you offer services within the EU, the rules apply to you, regardless of where your headquarters or your servers are. For complex companies, Article 26 defines the main establishment rule to figure out who has jurisdiction.
How do they define main establishment if you're operating in a dozen countries?
It's the member state where the decisions about your cybersecurity risk management are predominantly taken. So that's usually your corporate headquarters, where your CISO and your C-suite are setting security policy. If that can't be proven, it falls back to where your security operations are, or even just the establishment with the most employees in the EU.
So it forces companies to centralize their security decision-making.
It does. And for non-EU entities, there's a huge legal risk they face. They have a non-negotiable requirement to designate a legal representative in the EU. If they fail to do that, they face immediate, severe exposure. Failure to designate a representative allows any member state where you provide services to take legal action against you.
So you could be fighting enforcement actions from multiple countries at once.
It would be a regulatory nightmare.
Okay, let's go back to that supply chain pitfall. Let's say my critical SaaS provider has a massive breach, and that impacts my service availability. My clock starts ticking. How does NIS2 see that relationship?
Your NIS2 reporting clock starts immediately, regardless of what your supplier is doing. The responsibility for reporting the incident that's impacting your regulated operations rests entirely with you.
Wow.
Your internal incident response plan has to include protocols for tracking these upstream notifications from suppliers. That goes back to Measure #4, and for escalating that information internally fast enough to meet your own 24/72/30 timeline. You are responsible for the downstream impact, even if the root cause was external.
The need for immutable, time-stamped logs for every single step of that 24/72/30 process is just enormous. You can't possibly manage that kind of complex documentation flow with spreadsheets.
Absolutely not. It demands dedicated GRC tooling that gives you audit-ready evidence. Every notification, every internal meeting, every mitigation step has to be recorded against that strict timeline, mapped to your controls, and be ready for immediate inspection by a regulator.
And that need for rigorous, auditable evidence generated under intense time pressure is exactly why platforms like those linked to www.compliancehub.wiki and www.cisomarketplace.com are so vital. They provide that centralized evidence repository and the automated tracking you need to survive the administrative burden of that incident clock. Okay, we've established that NIS2 moves cybersecurity straight to the boardroom. Let's look at the real-world implications of Article 20, which puts direct obligations and direct risk on the management bodies, the C-suite, and the board.
Article 20 is the absolute game changer. Management bodies are now required to explicitly approve the cybersecurity risk management measures from Article 21, and they have to oversee their implementation. And this can't just be a rubber stamp. It requires genuine knowledge and scrutiny.
And the directive actually mandates training for the C-suite itself. What does that involve, and how do they prove they've done it?
Right. The members of the management bodies have to follow specific, mandated training to gain sufficient knowledge to actually assess the entity's risks and security practices.
This isn't just a generic IT Security 101 course.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
This training has to cover the specific threats that face their sector, the legal implications of failing to comply with NIS2, and the board's specific oversight duties. To prove they've done it, the company has to document who attended, what the curriculum was, the time commitment, and how they were assessed. That documentation becomes a critical piece of audit evidence.
And if the organization fails to comply, the risk of personal liability is now very real.
It is the ultimate deterrent. The management bodies are directly accountable. The sanctions go beyond the corporate bank account. For essential entities, if other enforcement measures don't work, regulators can issue a temporary ban preventing any responsible manager, the CEO, a board member, from exercising those functions in that company.
So the regulator can actually intervene in the governance of the company.
They can remove you from your job.
Wow. Okay, let's detail the supervisory powers again, focusing on the teeth that the competent authorities have. We have that clear split between essential and important entities.
For essential entities who are under that proactive ex-ante regime, the powers are highly intrusive. They include the right to conduct random, unscheduled on-site inspections, regular security audits, and even the power to designate a monitoring officer inside your company.
And if they find problems?
They can issue binding instructions. That's a legal order requiring you to fix a specific problem by a specific deadline. And failing to meet that instruction is a whole separate breach of the directive.
So an E is basically under perpetual government scrutiny. What about the important entities under the reactive ex post regime?
Well, while it's reactive, the powers is still very strong. Supervision gets triggered by suspicion or evidence of a problem. But once it's triggered, the authorities can still conduct on-site inspections, order targeted security audits, and demand comprehensive evidence of compliance.
And here's the really unpredictable financial hit, separate from the fines, the externalization of audit costs.
This is a point that companies often miss in their risk modeling. The authorities can order a targeted security audit by an independent third party, and the directive explicitly says that the cost of that audit shall be paid by the audited entity.
So a regulator can force you to pay for a multi-million euro external audit of your own company.
They can. And it creates this significant, unpredictable expenditure exposure that you have to account for.
Now, for the headline numbers,
Yeah.
the monetary penalties. These are clearly designed to be a serious deterrent modeled directly on the scale of GDPR fines.
The fines are calculated based on your global annual turnover from the previous fiscal year.
Okay.
For essential entities, it's the higher of 10 million euros or 2% of total annual worldwide turnover. For important entities, it's the higher of 7 million euros or 1.4% of total annual worldwide turnover.
For any large multinational, 2% of global turnover is a catastrophic financial event. And I know in some national laws, like Belgium's, they've explicitly said those fines can be doubled for a repeat offense within a 3-year window.
The fine structure is absolutely designed to guarantee executive attention. Compliance is simply cheaper than the fine, especially when you factor in the other costs.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's quickly connect NIS2 to the broader EU regulatory world. It's part of a much bigger push for resilience. We mentioned DORA for finance, but what about the CER Directive and the Cyber Solidarity Act?
Right, so the CR Directive Critical Entities Resilience focuses on the physical and operational resilience of critical services. Think energy pipelines, transport hubs,
The physical world.
the physical world. And any entity that's identified under CER is automatically classified as an essential entity under NIS2. The two directives are intrinsically linked. CER covers physical risks, NIS2 covers digital risks.
And the newest piece of this puzzle is the Cyber Solidarity Act.
The Cyber Solidarity Act, or CSA, is all about collective EU-level defense. So while NIS2 sets the minimum bar for what each organization has to do, the CSA establishes mechanisms like an EU cyber shield and a cyber emergency mechanism. It complements NIS2 by providing a coordinated rapid response structure for dealing with huge cross-border incidents that might overwhelm a single nation's capacity.
So NIS2 makes sure you report the incident, and the CSA makes sure there's a structure to help fight it.
Exactly.
So for all of those newly in-scope entities, the manufacturers, the food producers, the chemical companies, what is the immediate non-negotiable next step?
Start your gap analysis now. Integrate your IT and OT risk management into one unified framework. Document the mandatory training for your management body. And fundamentally, you have to shift from a reactive security model to one that's focused on demonstrable control effectiveness on measure #6. Look at established standards like ISO 27001's Annex A controls. They align very heavily with the 10 measures.
And that necessity for robust documentation and evidence mapping brings us to our final sponsor. Thank you.
The shift under NIS2 really demands GRC excellence. You need that immutable, time-stamped evidence for every phase of the 24/72/30 timeline, and you have to map your actions to specific controls for both the regulators and your own board. To master this complex documentation and evidence chain, you should turn to the expert resources and compliance platforms you can find at www.compliancehub.wiki and www.cisomarketplace.com. They offer the solutions to really simplify that journey toward being audit-ready.
This has been a huge deep dive, really exploring the dramatic restructuring of European cybersecurity risk under NIS2. Let's do a final review of the 3 core strategic demands that you need to be addressing immediately.
Okay, first, comprehensive risk management. That means implementing those 10 minimum measures, including mandatory MFA, rigorous ITOT integration, and having enforceable security clauses in your supply chain contracts. That's measure #4.
Right.
Second, rapid incident reporting. You have to master that non-negotiable 24/72/30 timeline. That means rewarding speed over certainty and ensuring you're synchronized with any GDPR obligations.
And third.
And third, board-level accountability. Management bodies have to approve the policies, they have to undergo that mandatory training, and they have to accept direct personal liability for compliance failures.
And we have to say it one last time. Even as of today, December 5th, 2025, with national transposition still lagging in major countries like Germany and the Netherlands, the core EU obligations are active. Waiting for your specific national law to be finalized is a strategy that is dramatically increasing your risk.
The crucial immediate action item is simple. Conduct an immediate, accurate self-assessment. Use the SME size thresholds in the Annex I and II sector lists. Know your classification. Are you an essential entity or an important entity? That one fact defines your supervisory exposure and dictates the urgency of your entire response.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as we wrap up this deep dive.
NIS2 forces organizations to adopt what is essentially a form of indirect regulatory pressure, because measure #4 holds you, the regulated entity, accountable for your supplier's failures, you are compelled to impose NIS2 standards onto your non-regulated third parties through your contracts. The liability is passed upstream through commercial terms. So the question for you to take back to your legal and compliance teams is this. Are your contracts sophisticated enough to legally compel your suppliers to meet your NIS2 standards, including mandatory MFA and rapid incident reporting? Or are you just passively accepting massive, unmitigated liability for your entire digital supply chain as your own?
A truly challenging question, and one that defines the new competitive landscape in Europe. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive into the NIS2 Directive.
Thank you.
Until next time, stay secure, stay informed, and stay compliant.